The Fujifilm X-T4 came out 4 years ago, almost to the day as I'm recording this, and I have owned it for 3 of those years. In this time, I've gone from simply enjoying this camera to absolutely loving this camera, and I dare say that it is my favorite camera, period, right now. And over the course of the next 10 or so minutes, I would like to show you why. The X-T4 features the XT line's signature look, which I would describe as being a mix of classic film camera and modern usability, with dedicated ISO, shutter speed, and exposure compensation dials on the top of the camera. That, when paired with Fujifilm's excellent lineup of lenses, which almost all have an aperture ring on them, means that you have a physical control point for every part of the exposure triangle, which I think is great. Underneath those marked dials, you will also find 2 unmarked dials, which can be customized as well as pushed for 2 additional buttons. Those 2 dials are perfect for when you want to operate this camera with just one hand. Underneath those 2 dials, you'll find a control stick and 4 more customizable buttons. Beside those unmarked buttons, you will find the X-T4's 26 megapixel sensor, which is the same sensor that's found in the X-T3, X100V, and X-E4, just to name a few. In addition to that sensor, you are able to record video at up to 240 frames per second at 1080p or 60 frames per second at 4K. The camera also has in-body image stabilization, and it is the first XT camera to feature that. It has a 3.7 million dot OLED viewfinder, a flippy out screen, which some people hate and some people love, 2 SD card slots, a mic and headphone jack, and to round it off, a USB-C port and micro HDMI port on the side. The camera is also made out of a magnesium alloy, aka it's made out of metal, which gives it a distinctly higher quality feeling to it, and as I can attest over the years, has made it distinctly more durable. The X-T4's battery is also significantly better than Fuji's old style of battery, being able to go multiple days on a single battery if you're just taking photos, or in my experience about a day and a half if you're intensely doing video and photo work. Whether you're shooting in RAW or JPEG, I think the images that come out of this camera look great. The images are crisp and filled with detail. I personally love that with this camera you get the option to shoot in both RAW and JPEG at the same time, giving you those signature Fuji looks out of the JPEG as well as a copy that you can play with if something doesn't go right. I have found that the 26 megapixel sensor is still plenty of resolution to do some cropping and end up with an image that I'm happy with. ISO performance wise, I would say that I'm quite happy with this camera up to about ISO 6400. At that point it takes a hit that I'm not quite comfortable with. That being said, with the in-body stabilization being as good as it is, you probably won't need to push your ISO all that much unless if you're in a very low light situation. Now is also probably a good time to mention Fuji's excellent selection of inbuilt film stocks and looks, their film emulations. In the X-T4, you're getting access to Fuji's lineup of classic film stocks and looks, and in addition to that, you're also able to make your own looks and then share those with other people and download them from the community. I think these looks are great for when you're just wanting to get a photo that looks nice and you're not wanting to do a whole bunch of editing to it. Whether or not they're actually accurate to the original film stocks, I honestly don't know. Let's switch gears for a second and talk about the video implementation of this camera, because the more I've used it, the more I've been seriously impressed with it. First, you have a dedicated photo/video switch, which gives you a physical dial to switch between the 2 modes, which stay completely separate of each other with different menus and settings. When you shoot video, you have 2 different options for how you control it. You have the standard option, which lets you use the top dials the same way you would for taking a photo, and then you have the video mode, which lets you use that front and back dial on the camera. I absolutely love this because when you do it like that, you are able to switch between photo and video and have all of your settings be the same way you left them right before, while still having those physical dials. This makes it so much easier for when you want to take a photo and then quickly switch back to video and not have to change all of those settings around each time. That mentality goes goes through every part of this camera when it comes to photo and video, with even completely different menu layouts for photo and video, which are kept completely separate of each other. I'm not kidding when I say that I think every camera should do photo and video this way. The video that comes out of this camera is just like its photos, fantastic. As I mentioned at the start, this camera is capable of shooting 240 FPS at 1080p or 4K 60 FPS. But in addition to that, you are also able to shoot this camera with 10-bit color and F-Log, Fujifilm's log format, which I personally think makes an excellent looking end result, all without needing an external recorder or monitor. You're also able to put custom LUTs onto the back screen, making it way easier to see how your final product is going to look when you're shooting in log format. That, when paired with this camera's overall small size and in-body image stabilization, makes this a fantastic travel camera. And all of this, keep in mind, you can find in a camera right now that costs $1,000 or less. In a world where Fujifilm's other cameras are selling sometimes for double or triple their MSRP on the used market, I think this camera is a steal of a deal. I've talked a lot about the positives of this camera, but what about some of the negatives? The screen, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a love it or hate it style compared to a traditional flipping screen. Personally, for video, I like it more. However, for photography, I like it less than a traditional flipping screen. While we're talking about the screen, this screen's also a touch screen, and I personally just don't really like it. I find that I am always touching something accidentally, either my focus or a shot, and I frankly just turn it off entirely. There are enough customizable buttons on this camera, you don't need the touch screen to add extra features to it. Another thing about this camera is the autofocus. When you pair it with, say, the Viltrox 85mm f1.8, the autofocus on this camera can be quite slow. When you pair it with one of Fuji's native lenses, like the 23mm f2, I think that it is quite fast. However, your mileage may vary. And lastly, for video, the 240 FPS mode, while impressive, does take a noticeable quality hit when compared with 60 FPS or 120 FPS. And 4K mode on this camera does come with a crop. I mentioned with this camera at the start that I liked it, but I didn't necessarily love it. And I would say that I had what I would describe as growing pains over the course of having this camera. Let's talk about a few of them. To put it simply, when I first got this camera, I didn't think it was the most comfortable thing in the world. And frankly, I came from Sony cameras, and as someone with large hands, those were far more comfortable to me. With the X-T4, I tried getting an external grip for it, but then that made it too large to fit into my bag comfortably. Another thing that took some getting used to with this camera was just the amount of customizability it has. It might sound silly, but if you count the touch screen, this camera has 14 different customizable buttons, each with 60 different options to them. And that's just for the photo mode. So when I first got this camera, there were several buttons which just did things that I didn't care about, or there were functions that I did care about that didn't have buttons assigned to them. Now, being a couple years later, I've really gotten into the groove of how I like to use this camera, and I have everything set up the way that I want it to be. But it does take some time. I don't like making blanket recommendations for things, because the last thing that I want is for you to go out and buy this camera just to get it and not be super happy with it because you listened to me. So here's what I will say. If this camera broke tomorrow, the first thing that I would do is buy another one. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.